10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
For our second lesson on early humans, we're going to fast forward a little bit from where we ended our last lecture. If you recall, we ended right around the year 6000 BCE, roughly. Today we're going to start around 3500 BCE. By this time, humans are moving around, settling in new homes, building small communities, and working together to improve their lives. Let's check more out so we can learn about how these civilizations would further expand and become some of the more interesting ones in early history. First, we're going to look at our terms, as usual. We got a couple terms to become familiar with. Then we're going to get into setting our stage, setting ourselves up for the beginning of the lesson, reminding ourselves about agriculture and how important that was to early humans. Then we're going to get into the villages and how they would eventually transform and evolve into the cities that we've heard of before. Next, we'll talk about what it takes for these early civilizations and early cities to be successful, the different elements that need to be there in order for these communities and these cities to endure. And finally, we'll talk about an example, or two examples actually, of some of these early civilizations, specifically the region of Sumer and Babylon, as well as some of its early significant rulers and their contributions to these civilizations. All right, our first term is civilization. Simply put, a complex culture consisting of specific characteristics to make it function specifically or function successfully. Civilizations don't just come around overnight. Things had to have happened. So we're going to look at those different elements of what makes civilizations work in a little bit. Artisans are skilled workers who make goods by hand, such as tools, arrowheads, clay pottery, things like that. Even as simple as simple art that we might have seen in some old art. So people that make things with their hands. Cuneiform is an early form of writing using a wedged-shaped tool that they would imprint on clay in order to perform some sort of communication task, to provide some sort of information. A ziggurat is a pyramid-shaped structure thought to serve as both a religious center and a community center for some of these early civilizations. How big of a deal was agriculture, do you think? Well, how many of you would like to eat? Well, remember, without agriculture, people would have to continue to be hunter-gatherers, people roaming the area looking for their food. However, remember that once people realized the benefits of tending to their own crops, people were able to stay in one place, have a surplus of food, thereby allowing for population to expand. Once people started staying put, the dwellings began to get larger, and the areas began to get more organized as a community. As population increased, so did the cities, and these cities would grow gradually. As these cities grew, and there was less need for everyone to be involved in agriculture, economics would begin to matter. People began to understand the value of work and trade. As more and more people were able to be fed, more and more people were able to stay in one place. These small villages eventually grew into sustainable cities. Farming became easier due to advances in technology and the domestication of animals. Remember, the domestication of animals simply refers to the ability of people to keep animals round up at home, kind of like cattle. Because of the use of agriculture, bigger harvests were a result, and from new and better technologies were also able to become implemented to make these jobs easier. It is a fact that the more food that we have in supply in a community, the bigger the population that it can support. So as cities grew, so did the responsibilities of those who lived there. Not everyone needed to farm anymore. Farmers would create enough food for maybe 10 people. Well, one farmer anyway. There was no point to having so much food. The technology of the wheel and the sail allowed people to travel longer distances. This was a time before any type of currency had been invented yet, though. So it's important to remember that even though they didn't have like dollars and pennies, they did have a system typically known as bartering, the trading of things in order to get what you need. As the cities grew, social classes also began to emerge. Those that were considered better people or better classes than others were based upon what items they could sell or barter with, as well as what services they could provide to others compared to that of other people. Religion also began to become more organized as well. Based on findings of research, people began to worship in larger groups at specific locations rather than just amongst themselves and their families or small groups. Now, to understand what I mean by civilization, we need to look at exactly what it means for a civilization to develop. Civilizations are a complex form of culture that consists of 5 key characteristics. First, every civilization consists of what are known as advanced cities. The size of a city or an area doesn't distinguish it from a village. You can have a very long or a very small area of land and it's considered a city, as opposed to as the opposite also being true, where a large area of land doesn't necessarily mean it can't be a village. One of the key parts to having an advanced city, though, is it must be a center for trade. So similarly, these advanced cities need to have locations for people to buy and sell things. The buying and selling of goods and services creates an economy within the area, allowing for people who live there to make money and survive much more comfortably. The second part of what characterizes a civilization is that it has to have specialized workers. Specialization is the development of skills in a specific kind of work. An example might be someone who is good at making tools and turns that into his profession. Not everyone might be good at making tools back in the day, so they might rely on those few who are good at it. Another type of specialized worker are artisans. As we talked about before in our terms, these are people who are skilled workers who are able to make things with their hands, such as painting or sculptors or builders, tool makers, things like that. Although it doesn't seem like it's an important thing regarding to what makes civilization function, artisans are what makes a civilization unique. You can learn a lot about a civilization just by looking at their artistic creations. The third characteristic of a civilization is its complex institutions. An institution is a long-lasting pattern of an organization within a community. Things that have been there for a long time that can help identify what is important to that society. Can you think of anything in our culture or your culture that's been around for a long time that's very important to the society you live in? Some examples might be for like the American institutions might include governments, religion, and our economy, education styles, things like that. Things that have been around for a long time and help us better to define what it means to us to be an American. Those things that make us separate from others can sometimes be included in our institutions. Record keeping is also an intricate part of a civilization. Included with record keeping, you have taxes being collected, laws being passed, and the storage of grain and other items that need to be recorded. Around 3000 BCE, Sumerian scribes, professional record keepers, invented a writing system known as cuneiform. If you look on page 21 in our textbook, you can see examples of cuneiform, as well as on the bottom of our slide here. Simply, it's a brick of clay or a slab of clay with wedge-shaped symbols that are carved into them when the clay is still wet. And then eventually it dries and hardens. These symbols and how they're placed on the clay tablet tells the record keeper or the scribe what exactly is going on with this. Early on, a lot of these cuneiform writings included, again, tax information, the storage of grain information, things like that. How much grain was brought in one year compared to the next, things like that. So any of these items could be used or anything could be recorded on this cuneiform slab in order to store information. Finally, our civilization needs to have advanced technology as the last piece for our civilization. Examples of advanced technology back then might include the creation of plows, pottery wheels, using bronze to create tools or weapons. And although some of these things seem very basic and insignificant by today's standards, these things were needed back then in order, again, to make these civilizations successful. Without the use of advanced technology, these cultures would not have evolved and survived as long as they did. Melting copper and tin together is what would make a new metal called bronze. And again, this is an example of using new technology in order to help the people for the needs they had back then. Now that we have the basics, what does it take to be considered a civilization? Let us look now on the first known civilizations. The first civilization that occurred in this area we know today as Mesopotamia. It is also sometimes known as the Fertile Crescent, simply because it kind of makes the shape of a crescent. Mesopotamia runs from the Mediterranean Sea, way up here on the left, and goes all the way over and down to the Persian Gulf. You'll find that almost every major civilization exists near bodies of water. This was because water was needed to survive, as well as provide the opportunity to travel and trade with others. You'll also notice that in the Fertile Crescent we got two major river systems, the Euphrates River and the Tigris River. Again, these are freshwater rivers which allow them to provide crops or water for their crops, transportation. The Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf are saltwater seas, so they were good for transportation but not for drinking. They did, however, need the Euphrates and the Tigris River for the purpose of growing food as well as drinking water. So keep that in mind as well. So let's take a closer look around the region of Mesopotamia and a little bit more about its geography. Most of Mesopotamia is located in modern-day Iraq. It also spreads west into modern-day countries of Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. Because of how the rivers flow and the foliage of the land, or how the land flows in elevation, you can see that the Mesopotamia, as I mentioned before, is kind of in an arc or a crescent shape. Hence why it's called the Fertile Crescent, because it's a fertile area kind of in the shape of a crescent. As I mentioned earlier, the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers run through the region and provide water for transportation as well as water for the crops. One of the more interesting parts of this river, though, is that it would flood. Unfortunately, it would flood unpredictably. After water would recede or go down, it would leave a thick layer of mineral-rich silt. This silt is great for agriculture. These rivers, however, as I mentioned, were unpredictable and didn't always flood from one year to the next. This period of rain could sometimes cause desert conditions. Because of this, the solution used by many of the people would be irrigation, or the moving of water from one place to the other. The region of Mesopotamia was generally flat and didn't provide any real natural barrier for protection. The solution for that was, of course, building walls. And finally, because of the natural resources being so scarce, those that lived in the region would also need to rely upon trade to get any goods or anything that they needed but could not be provided by where they lived. So they also created these trade networks where people would trade from community to community, city to city, for those areas that are around them. One of the earliest successful civilizations that we know of in this area is the region of Sumer, which is this orange area here on our map. It lasted from about 3200 BCE until about 2360 BCE. People that lived in this region of Sumer were known as Sumerians. The Sumerians exemplified those 5 characteristics that make up a civilization. The Sumerians were a group of people that had developed city-states, which are cities that functioned like an independent country. There were also small cities that were independent from the bigger ones as well as around them. But sometimes the larger cities would envelop or take over some of these small cities. Early on, the governments were controlled by temple priests or religious leaders. These religious leaders would have their center of government in what we know as a ziggurat, which is simply a place of worship. This would be like a town hall, but also act as the religious church or temple for the people that lived in the area. Sometimes, depending on which city-state you lived in, a military would become a ruler and pass his powers on to his son upon his death. When leaders pass their leadership to a family member, this becomes what's known as a dynasty, a series of rulers that came from the same family line. Because these city-states were so close to one another, people from different areas would mingle and trade ideas as well as products. This trading of ideas is known as cultural diffusion, the spreading of ideas or products from one culture to another through conquest or trade. Here we see what a ziggurat looks like. On the left far side we can see an example of one that actually survived that is more than 4,000 years old. On the right side, this is an easier aerial picture of what it kind of looks like from an elevated point. Let's take a deeper look at the Sumerian culture. Sumerians were polytheistic, which means that they had the belief in more than one god. Part of that belief included the idea that when you die, you would go to what's known as the land of no return, a dismal and gloomy place that nobody really wanted to go to, as you can imagine. As we will see throughout this year, with most civilizations, including the Sumerians, They created what's known as a social class system, a hierarchical, power-based system used to determine who's got the power in a civilization and who doesn't. A lot of times we can see this hierarchical social class system in the form of a triangle, like the one we see on the right side here. As we go out through these lessons, you'll see more of these triangles and how this helps determine the leadership and the position people have within a society. One unique and interesting thing about the Sumerians and their hierarchical system was that women had a lot more rights during this civilization than other civilizations that would come later, such as the Egyptians or the Chinese, for example. So it's important to know that a lot of times women didn't exactly have the same rights as men through many of these cultures that we're going to talk about. So please pay attention to those when we talk about the rights of women and other groups as we go into further lessons in the future. One of the world's first cities was the city of Ur. It flourished around 5,000 years ago. It had a population that reached probably around 30,000 people. They built city walls to protect them from other city-states trying to invade and take over their land. And they also had a trading system, known as a barter system, where instead of trading money for goods, they would actually trade goods and services. So if I need a new roof, you could say, I will, if you let me buy that cow, I will do your roof next spring. So they would trade things instead of coins and dollars and things like that. And again, that's known as a barter system. They would also worship with their religion at the ziggurat, which, as we mentioned before, was kind of the town center. Usually, again, it was in the middle of the town, well guarded, usually with a wall around it, as we'll see in a few moments here. But again, religion was important to a lot of these early cultures, especially in the city of Ur. And here we see on our map the two rivers, Euphrates and the Tigris River, and here's the region known as Ur, and the capital city is kind of that dot. Ur kind of would take over this entire area through conquest mainly, and it would all fall under one ruling party. From time to time, there'd be invaders taking over parts of this, but in general, this is the area known as Ur. Here we see an artist's idea of what Ur might have looked like. It had a centralized protected area by walls, which we see, with the ziggurat well inside. Here's the ziggurat. Outside the walls, you can see smaller dwellings of homes of the other community members outside the wall, with some access over this moat here into the main part of the city. But it's important to realize that, again, Ur was one of these early civilizations with a larger population because of their advanced technologies and all those other things needed to have a successful civilization. As with most ancient civilizations, Sumer was conquered in 2350 BCE by a guy named Sargon of Akkad. Sargon would create the world's first empire, bringing together several people or nations under the control of one ruler. On one of these rulers later on would come from Babylon, and his name was Hammurabi, which we'll talk more about later on. He would create one of the world's first set of standards rules for an empire. This set of rules would become known as Hammurabi's Code. Hammurabi's Code was a uniform set of laws engraved in stone to help unify the diverse groups within his empire, so that everybody knew by reading these stones what the laws were. He is not the first person to create a set of laws, obviously, But if you look, as we will later on, at these laws he created, the idea of following the laws and the punishments for breaking these laws was kind of a new idea. And because they were written down for everybody to see, there was no reason or no questioning what was allowed and what wasn't in this civilization. And here we see kind of engravings of these codes on what's known as a stele, which were big stones. But these are the carvings of those rules of Hammurabi's code. In today's lesson, we looked at how cities would begin to grow and expand as agriculture improved, and in turn allowed populations in these cities to get larger and larger to the point that lasting civilizations would begin to evolve and develop. We also identified 5 different parts needed to make sure a civilization was successful. And finally, we introduced the civilizations of Sumer and Babylon and some of their early rulers and their contributions to society, and perhaps how these contributions may have even helped modern day societies as well. Though Mesopotamia would be the beginning of civilization, it wasn't long until others began to take hold as well. South and east of Mesopotamia, new civilizations were slowly beginning to evolve and would become eventually the most and well-known mysterious civilizations of all, particularly Egypt. And with that, we are done for today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you do have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comment box below or speak with me in class. Other than that, I look forward to seeing you on our next lesson when we introduce Egypt. Take care and have a great day.